Welcome to Garden Wise Adventures. My name is Molly, and today is video number 34 on my Beginning Gardener series. And it's time finally to plant my tomatoes, and I'm really excited about that. Now it's mid-May, and it's actually a little bit before our first frost date, so that I really shouldn't be planting them for another week or two. But the weather has been excellent, and it's looking good for the next 2 weeks, and I do have methods to cover the tomatoes if we do end up having that late frost. And my tomatoes have really suffered, as you will soon see, because I planted them way too early and I did not pot them up. So before we plant the tomatoes, I kind of want to go over different types of tomatoes and show you what I have and what I'm going to be planting. So the first tomatoes I wanted to talk to you about, and these are looking a little wilty because I forgot that they needed to be watered actually, and I did turn on the water. But these are my paste tomatoes. Now there are different kinds of tomatoes. There's paste tomatoes, there's determinate, indeterminate, there's beefsteak and cherry tomatoes and slicing tomatoes, dwarf tomatoes, micro dwarf tomatoes. There's a lot of different terms you need to know that we will go over as you plant tomatoes. So these tomatoes are paste tomatoes. They have less water than regular tomatoes and less seeds. They have more flesh, so they're really good for canning. So the back row back there is Amish paste. Plus I think I have a mushroom basket. I forgot to put the label in here, but I think there's a mushroom basket in here, which is a slicing tomato. And then in the front I have my San Marzano paste tomatoes. Now some paste tomatoes are what are called determinate, meaning they'll grow to a determined height, produce all the tomatoes that they're going to produce and stop producing. But I've grown these tomatoes for many years and they never stop producing, so I think these are what are called indeterminate tomatoes. Now indeterminate tomatoes will just continue to grow until the end of the season or until they're too sick to grow any further. When you live in the south or in humid climates, tomatoes tend to succumb to disease more than they do here. Here they succumb to early frost, like sometimes in September. They'll grow and produce tomatoes all season. So these are my paste tomatoes. So now we're inside and I wanted to show you some tomatoes that I've been growing indoors and harvesting from. And these are my dwarf tomatoes. This is as tall as they're going to get, both inside and out, usually 3 to 5 feet. These are about 3 feet tall. And they've been producing these beautiful little tomatoes. They are red, they turn red with green striping on them, and they're absolutely gorgeous and really tasty. These are called Adelaide Festival, and in a couple of weeks when I plant my peppers, I will plant these outside. I just, I want to have some of these storms finish going through because these are a little weaker than my other tomatoes right now because they're so tall. So these are dwarf. I think dwarf tomatoes are determinate. This is the first time I've ever grown dwarf tomatoes before, and it's going to be interesting to see how long they produce. We do still have flowers on them. We have little tomatoes that are being produced. We've got another one back here somewhere. I've harvested a few off of it. So it'll be interesting to see how long this produces. Now here's another tomato that I've been growing and harvesting on from indoors, and this is a micro dwarf tomato. They don't get much taller than this. This one did suffer from some bug damage. We had some, I don't know where we got white flies, but we actually had white flies on this tomato and a few spider mites. But I've killed them and it's starting to come back, and I will be planting this out in one of my garden beds. They do really well in pots, they do really well in garden beds, just about anywhere you can grow them. You can also grow these hydroponically. And they're a really tasty little cherry tomato. And they're, this one is orange hat, but there's many varieties that you can plant. Now we'll move on to the indeterminate varieties. All the rest of these are indeterminate, which means they'll continue to grow and just get as tall as they're able to get. And we have several different varieties. This whole bed right here, except for the very end, are Jet Star, which is my favorite tomato. So these are just a great slicer. You can use them for just about anything. Really good taste, really great producer. We then have my Sun Sugar Cherry Tomato. Let me see if I can get my shadow out of the way. So this is a Sun Sugar Cherry Tomato. And it just produces the tastiest little tiny tomatoes you've ever tasted. I absolutely love them. They're orange and they're like sugar. And we're going to do an experiment. So there is Sun Sugar, and there's also Sun Gold. Now, I've never known the difference. I've never been able to tell the difference. So we're going to grow them in 2 different beds and see which one I like better. See if they taste the same, see if they look the same, kind of see what we could tell the difference is. So there we have the sun sugar. So there we have the cherry tomatoes. We have another slicer that's a darker tomato. This one's called Black Seaman, and I absolutely love the flavor on this one and then the look of it. It's just a dark tomato. Absolutely gorgeous and tasty. And then we're going to be into our beefsteak tomatoes. They're giant. I'll show you a picture of this one. This is a Kentucky beefsteak. Giant orange tomato, huge and heavy and really tasty. So that's the other one that I'm going to be growing. So now that we know the terms and we know what types of tomatoes I'm going to plant, let's talk about how I'm going to plant them. So there's many different ways to grow tomatoes, and I'm going to crowd 7 tomatoes and 1 tomatillo into each bed, along with some basil. These beds are 8 feet long and 2 feet wide, and I've staggered the poles so that they can each have a little bit more room. And then I'm going to just prune my tomatoes to a single stem, and we'll show you how that works in just a minute. But when you do it that way, you can grow more varieties of tomatoes in a smaller space. Now, I have grown tomatoes in many different ways. I've used tomato cages and not pruned my tomatoes at all. I've let them sprawl along the ground and not prune them at all. And I've done a Florida weave. And I like all the methods, but the most space-saving method, where you can get the most varieties of tomatoes in a single space, is the single stem method. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, if you want to grow healthy tomatoes, they have some very specific requirements. Number 1, they need quite a bit of fertilizer. Now, if you fertilize appropriately, fertilizing at planting times, most of the time is all that you need. You can top dress with compost a little bit later in the season, or if they're looking a little nutrient deficient or they've slowed down in growth, you can do a side dressing of an all-purpose fertilizer. When I say all-purpose, I mean one that has 3 numbers, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium numbers that are relatively similar. You could also look into tomato fertilizers, which is basically just taking those 3 numbers and tweaking them so that they're more what tomatoes will need. Tomatoes also need a lot of water, but they don't like to be watered shallowly, and they don't like to be watered very often. They want to be watered deeply and infrequently. So that's another reason why adding shutoff valves to my beds is going to help. A lot of the other plants that I have planted are going to need more water than the tomatoes, and so I can shut off the water to the beds with the tomatoes and water them only when they need it. Now, when we plant this tomato, what we're going to do, and I hope you can see this, we're going to pull off the bottom 2 leaves. You can see how tall and lanky this tomato is. It's because I grew them too close together and they've been in their pots too long. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to bury this tomato as deeply as possible, all the way up to that point. I've got a deep bed that we're putting it in, so let's get the bed fertilized and plant these tomatoes. Now, the soil in the beds that I'm going to put my tomatoes in is new. I've never used this type of soil before. It's one that I picked up from a local nursery. It's got topsoil, sand, and compost in it. And it's probably a good soil. I don't know, I did not get it tested, so I don't know what the nutrient contents are. So I am going to just hedge my beds. Definitely going to add nitrogen because I know it has to be nitrogen deficient. Going to add some worm castings because I think that'll just add a little bit extra nutrition and maybe help it hold some water a little bit. And then I'm going to add an all-purpose fertilizer. I'm not going to add as much of this because I have tested my other garden beds and they've tested quite high in phosphorus and potassium. So this bag here has 5% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 5% potassium. It also has some calcium and sulfur in it. So we're just going to add a little bit of this just in case this soil is a little deficient. I probably shouldn't, but bad habits die hard, so we're going to do it anyway. We're going to mix all of this in, and then we're going to plant the tomatoes. Now, before I add the fertilizer and mix it in, I wanted to show you what has been happening with this soil. You can see the crust that's forming on it. This, I'm pretty sure, is because of the clay in the topsoil. And this crust is not a good thing. The way we're going to help alleviate that problem is after we plant the tomatoes, we're going to mulch these beds in grass clippings and also in hay. The organic matter on the top will help avoid that crusting. And this is the grass that I've got to mow so that I can have grass clippings to mulch the beds with. Now that it's all amended and mixed together, let's dig a really deep hole right by the stake. Take our poor stressed tomato out of the pot. Now the roots are not all that bad, but I don't know if you can see on the video, but all along this stem there's little bumps, and those little bumps will all turn into roots. So let's bury this pretty deeply. Tuck it in. And then we're going to attach it to this pole. Now the way I like to attach my tomatoes is with this green stretchy tape. Just comes in a roll like this. It works beautifully. I loop it around the stem, and then I loop it back around the pole and tie it tight to the pole but not tight to the stem. This way it doesn't slide up and down the pole, but it doesn't girdle the stem either. So these are so tall, and it's been so windy lately, we're going to tie one at the bottom and one at the top. This way it's not going to slide up and down. Now we got to do one last thing. So on this tomato it looks pretty clean. So this is a leaf right here. This is the main stem, and we just want to leave the main stem. But if you notice right between here, between the main stem and this leaf, we have what is called a sucker. And we're going to just snap that off with my fingernails. So in this type of trellising, we don't want the side shoots. We just want the tomatoes to grow straight up. That'll give us a lot more room. And we also need to make sure that we don't have any leaves hanging down to the ground. So that was another reason to remove those leaves. So no leaves are touching the ground. Maybe a little bit later, when this tomato is a little bit stronger, we'll remove this leaf so that we have a good amount of space between the ground and the bottom leaves. Actually, look at this one right here. This one is touching the ground. What I'm going to do, instead of taking the whole thing off, I'm just going to leave some to photosynthesize and take the end off of it there. And this is where the tomato will continue to grow, right here. Well, once again, we're running out of daylight, but we've got the tomatoes all planted. They're looking a little wilty, A little worse for wear, and I actually broke one right there. We'll see how it does. I'm sure it's going to continue growing. It'll have new growth points down in between these leaf nodes, so it should be fine. We put some basil on the corners to spill over the edges, and then a couple over here. And that is it. It'll be interesting to see how my tomatoes do this year now that they've been planted a little bit early. And hopefully I was able to give you enough information that you could go plant tomatoes yourself. You still have plenty of time. In certain areas of the country, you actually can do 2 crops of tomatoes. Start some seeds now and plant a second crop in June. So I would love to hear what your favorite varieties of tomatoes are and if you've been able to plant them out yet. And if you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and go have a wonderful garden adventure.